The arrow passed so close to Caleb Warren's ear that he heard the fletching whisper against his skin. 3 heartbeats later, the mountain lion that had been mid-leap toward his daughter collapsed dead at his feet. The man who killed it stood 50 yards upslope with a bow still raised, and Caleb knew that face from the wanted posters nailed to every trading post between the Alleghenies and the Ohio River. If you're settling in for this story, hit that subscribe button below. And drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from folks all over. The winter of 1754 came early to the Western Virginia Territory, and it came mean. By the time the first snows fell in October, the settlements along Timber Creek had already buried 4 children to fever and 2 men to accidents that wouldn't have killed them if there'd been a proper doctor within 100 miles. The nearest fort sat 3 days' ride to the east, and that distance might as well have been an ocean once the snows began. Caleb Warren had brought his family across the mountains in the spring with promises of land and freedom. His wife Mary had believed in those promises because she loved him, and because the alternative was staying in a Pennsylvania town where her father's debts had made their name poison. Their daughters, Sarah and Rebecca, 9 and 7 years old, had treated the journey like an adventure until they saw what the frontier truly meant. Mud, endless work. A cabin with gaps between the logs that let the wind through. Neighbors who eyed newcomers with suspicion, because trust was a luxury and mistakes were often fatal. The stories about the Indian called White Crow had reached Timber Creek even before the Warrens arrived. Some said he was a Shawnee who'd gone mad and been cast out by his own people. Others claimed he was a Delaware warrior who'd murdered a family of settlers in cold blood and now lived like an animal in the high country, killing anyone who crossed into his territory. A trader passing through in August swore he'd seen White Crow feeding on the raw flesh of a deer, blood running down his chest, laughing at the sky like a demon. No 2 stories agreed on the details, but they all agreed on one thing. White Crow was death walking on 2 legs, and any man who valued his scalp kept clear of the upper ridges where smoke from his fires sometimes showed against the evening sky. Caleb had dismissed the stories as frontier nonsense. Every settlement had its local monster, some real threat wrapped in enough lies and exaggeration to become legend. He'd been more concerned with cutting enough firewood and getting the harvest in before the weather turned. But Mary had heard the stories too, and she'd seen how the other settlement women looked toward the mountains. Fear had a way of spreading like fever, and reason was a poor cure. The mountain lion attack happened on a cold morning in late October. Sarah had been sent to fetch water from the creek, and Rebecca had followed despite being told to stay near the cabin. The lion had come down from the high country, driven by hunger and the early cold, and it had picked the moment when both girls were away from the cabin, away from their father's rifle, away from anything but each other. Caleb had heard Rebecca scream. By the time he grabbed his rifle and cleared the cabin door, Sarah was backing away from the creek with her little sister behind her, and the lion was coming down the slope with the awful slow confidence of a predator that knew it had won. The distance was too great. Caleb's rifle was loaded, but the shot was impossible with the girls directly in line. He ran anyway, knowing he'd be too late, knowing he'd spend the rest of his life seeing this moment. Then the arrow had come from upslope, fast and true, and the lion had dropped like its strings were cut. The man who'd fired it stood motionless among the trees. He wore deerskin leggings and a hunting shirt, his black hair long and loose, his face marked with 3 white scars that ran from temple to jaw. The bow in his hands was unstrung now, held loose, non-threatening. He watched Caleb with an expression that gave away nothing. Caleb's rifle was up before he thought about it. The girls were crying behind him. The lion's body still twitched at his feet. And the Indian who'd just saved his daughters' lives stood watching him with eyes that expected violence, because violence was what always came. The moment stretched out. Caleb's hands were steady on the rifle, but his thoughts were chaos. This was White Crow. The stories had told him that much. The man who ate raw flesh and killed settlers for sport, the demon of the upper ridges. Except the arrow that killed the lion hadn't been meant for his daughters. It had saved them. And the man who'd fired it wasn't moving, wasn't threatening, just waiting to see what would happen next. Mary's voice came from behind. She'd reached the girls and was pulling them back toward the cabin. Her voice carried an edge of panic that Caleb had never heard before, not even during the worst of the crossing. "Get inside," she told them. "Now." Caleb kept the rifle up. The Indians still hadn't moved. For several heartbeats, they stood like that. Two men separated by 50 yards, and a dead lion, and more misunderstanding than either could name. Then White Crow took a single step backward. Another. He moved without hurry, without fear, just a simple withdrawal. Within moments, the trees had swallowed him, and Caleb was standing alone with his daughter's tears echoing in his ears, and the knowledge that nothing about what had just happened matched the stories he'd been told. That evening, Caleb sat in the cabin with his rifle across his knees and tried to explain to Mary what he'd seen. The other men from the settlement had come when word spread about the lion. They'd stood around the dead animal and listened to Caleb's account with faces that grew steadily darker. Save them? Thomas Pritchard had asked. Thomas was a thick-shouldered man from Massachusetts who'd taken land on the creek's north side and built his cabin like a fort, rifle slots in every wall. "You sure about that, Caleb? Sure he wasn't just after the lion's meat and your girls got lucky?" "I'm sure," Caleb said. "The shot was perfect, timed perfect. He killed it before it could reach them." Thomas looked at the arrow still buried in the lion's chest. Then he looked at the other men. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of someone who expected to be obeyed. "Could be he's getting bold. Testing us. Seeing how close he can come to our families before we do something about it." "He saved my daughters," Caleb said. This time, Thomas said, "What about next time? What happens when he decides he wants more than just to look?" "We've all heard the stories, Caleb. This isn't some friendly Delaware come to trade. This is White Crow. This is the one who what?" Caleb interrupted. "Killed a family? Ate their flesh? Danced in their blood? Have you seen any bodies, Thomas? Any actual proof he's done what the stories say?" The silence that followed was uncomfortable. Robert Chun, a trapper who'd lived in the territory longer than anyone else in the settlement, finally spoke up. His English carried the accent of Canton, but his knowledge of the frontier was deeper than any of them. "Stories come from somewhere," he said quietly. "Maybe not all true, maybe not all lies. But fear also comes from somewhere. People afraid for reason." "What reason?" Caleb asked. "What has he actually done?" Robert shrugged. "Not seen with my eyes. But people say many people. All say same things." "People say lots of things," Caleb said. "Doesn't make them true." Thomas picked up his rifle. "Whether he's a saint or the devil, he's too close to our families. We should track him. Drive him off. Make it clear he's not welcome in this valley." Several of the other men nodded. Caleb looked at them and saw the same fear Mary had worn earlier. The same unreasoning certainty that White Crow was a threat despite what had happened that morning, or maybe because of it. Maybe that was worse somehow. Maybe being helped by someone you'd been taught to fear was more terrifying than being attacked by them, because it meant your fear might be wrong, and if that fear was wrong, what else might be? "Leave him alone," Caleb said. "He helped us. I'm not going to repay that by hunting him." Thomas's face hardened. "Then you're a fool. And if something happens to your family because you couldn't do what needed doing, that's on you." The men left. Caleb sat in his cabin and felt the weight of their judgment. Mary sat across from him, mending a shirt by candlelight. She hadn't spoken since the men arrived. Now she set down her needle and looked at him with eyes that carried their own questions. "Do you believe the stories?" she asked. "I believe what I saw," Caleb said. "That's not what I asked." He didn't have an answer for her, not one that made sense. So they sat in silence and listened to their daughters breathe in the loft above. And outside the cabin, the wind picked up and carried the first real promise of the winter to come. November brought storms that turned the world white and made travel between cabins treacherous. The settlement contracted. People stayed close to their fires and their families. Livestock that couldn't be brought inside froze in their pens. The creek became a ribbon of ice, and the work of survival consumed every waking hour. White Crow was seen twice more before the month ended. Once by Robert Chun, who was running his trapline along the upper ridge and spotted him watching from across a ravine. Robert had raised his hand in greeting, more from instinct than thought. White Crow had simply turned and walked away. The second time was late one evening when a cabin belonging to the Hendersons caught fire from a spark that jumped from the hearth. The family had been asleep. They would have died in the smoke and flames except that someone had pounded on their door hard enough to wake them. By the time they stumbled outside, coughing and burned but alive, whoever had raised the alarm was gone. But John Henderson swore he'd seen a figure running back toward the high country, and he'd seen the white scars on the man's face. Thomas Pritchard organized a hunting party anyway. 6 men with rifles and dogs and enough supplies for a week in the high country. They left on a clear morning in early December and came back 4 days later with nothing to show but frostbite and exhaustion. White Crow's trail had led them in circles through country so rough that 2 of the men had taken falls that could have killed them. The dogs had lost the scent repeatedly, confused by tricks that seemed impossible, water crossings, long stretches over bare rock. At one point, they'd found one of their own supply caches, abandoned the day before, with the food removed and replaced by dressed deer meat. "He's playing with us," Thomas said when they returned. "Making fools of us. Showing us he can go where he wants and we can't touch him. Or maybe he's just better at living out here than we are," Caleb said. Thomas gave him a look that promised trouble later. But the failed hunt had taken the edge off the men's enthusiasm for tracking White Crow. Winter was hard enough without adding impossible pursuits through hostile country. They settled into an uneasy truce with the knowledge that somewhere in the mountains above them, a man they'd been taught to fear was living his life, and for reasons none of them could explain, occasionally helping them survive. Christmas came without church or celebration. The cold had locked them all in place. Families made do with what they had. The Warrens roasted a turkey that Caleb had shot in November and preserved in the snowbank behind the cabin. Sarah and Rebecca sang the hymns their mother had taught them. For a few hours, the cabin felt almost warm, almost safe, almost like the life they'd left behind in Pennsylvania. Then January arrived, and with it came the sickness. It started with the youngest children. Fever first, then a cough that rattled in their chests like stones in a box. Within a week, every cabin in Timber Creek had at least one sick child. Within 2 weeks, 3 children had died, and the rest weren't far behind. The adults tried everything they knew. Teas brewed from bark, poultices, prayer, nothing worked. The sickness just spread, moving from family to family, from child to child, until the settlement rang with coughing and the sound of parents begging God for mercy. Sarah fell sick on a Tuesday. Rebecca followed 2 days later. Mary sat up with them through the nights, bathing their faces with snow water, trying to get them to drink. Caleb stood helpless and useless, watching his daughters burn with fever and knowing there was nothing he could do. The nearest doctor was at the fort 3 days away, and the snows had made that journey impossible. Even if he could reach the fort, even if the doctor would come, it would be too late. By the end of the second week, 10 children were dead. The rest were fading. The settlement had become a graveyard waiting to happen, and the parents could do nothing but watch and pray and hold their children while they slipped away. The morning that Sarah stopped breathing, Caleb walked out into the snow with his rifle and no clear idea of where he was going or what he intended to do. Mary was inside with the girls, her face hollow with exhaustion and grief. Rebecca was still alive, but barely, her breath coming in shallow gasps that seemed to get weaker with every hour. Sarah's body lay wrapped in blankets on the table, and Caleb couldn't look at her, couldn't accept that his daughter was gone, and there was nothing he could have done to prevent it. He walked north without thinking, following the creek until it bent east, and the terrain rose toward the high country. The snow was knee-deep in places. His breath came in clouds. The rifle was a dead weight in his hands, useful for nothing, a symbol of his complete inability to protect what mattered most. Somewhere in the white silence, he realized he was being followed. The tracks appeared off to his left, running parallel to his own path. Fresh tracks, large, unshod feet despite the snow and cold. Caleb stopped and raised his rifle, then lowered it again because what did it matter? If White Crow wanted to kill him, tracking him through open snow seemed like a poor way to do it. And if he didn't want to kill him, then what was the point of the rifle? "Show yourself," Caleb called. For a moment, nothing. Then a figure stepped from behind a stand of birch trees 30 yards away. White Crow watched him with the same neutral expression he'd worn the day he killed the lion. He carried no weapons that Caleb could see. His hands were empty, held slightly away from his body in a gesture that might have meant peace or might have meant nothing at all. "My daughter died this morning," Caleb said. The words came without planning, without thought. "The other one's dying now. All of them are dying. All the children in the settlement. We can't stop it. We don't know how." White Crow didn't respond, didn't move, just watched. "I don't know why I'm talking to you," Caleb continued. "I don't know what I'm doing out here. I just couldn't stay in that cabin anymore. Couldn't watch her die. Couldn't do nothing." The silence stretched between them. Then White Crow took several steps forward, slowly, deliberately. He stopped 10 yards away and knelt in the snow. With one hand, he drew something in the white surface. A simple shape. When he finished, he pointed at it, then at Caleb, then back toward the settlement. Caleb moved closer and looked at what had been drawn. A plant, leaves and root system, sketched with enough detail that he could see the specific shape. White Crow pointed at it again, more insistently. Then he stood and walked away, back toward the birch trees, back toward the high country. "Wait," Caleb called. "What does that mean? What plant is that?" But White Crow was gone, swallowed by the forest as if he'd never been there at all. Caleb stood looking at the drawing in the snow, trying to commit every detail to memory, knowing somehow that this was important, but not understanding why. He returned to the settlement as the sun reached its peak. Robert Chun was outside his cabin, smoking a pipe and looking at the mountains. Caleb approached him with the drawing fresh in his mind, describing what he'd seen as clearly as he could. Robert listened without interrupting, his eyes narrowing as Caleb described the root system and the specific shape of the leaves. "Ginseng," Robert said finally, "wild ginseng. But not the kind that grows in the valleys. This is mountain ginseng. Very rare, very powerful. Chinese medicine uses for many things, fevers, sickness, but not easy to find, especially in winter." "Where would it grow?" Caleb asked. Robert shook his head. "High country, north-facing slopes, under old trees, but in January, under snow. Finding it would be nearly impossible, even if you knew where to look." Caleb thanked him and turned back toward his cabin. Mary met him at the door with eyes that told him Rebecca had gotten worse. He went inside and looked at his surviving daughter, her face pale and sheened with sweat despite the cold, her breath barely stirring the air. Sarah's body still lay on the table. They'd have to bury her soon, once the ground thawed enough to dig. If Rebecca died first, they'd bury them together. Mary touched his arm. "Where did you go?" "I saw him," Caleb said. "White Crow. He showed me something, a plant. Robert says it might help, might? It's ginseng, mountain ginseng. Robert says it's used for fevers and sickness in China. But he also says finding it in winter would be nearly impossible." Mary looked at him for a long moment, then she looked at Rebecca. When she spoke, her voice was steady despite everything, but not completely impossible. "No," Caleb admitted, "not completely." "Then you have to try." Caleb left at dawn with a pack of supplies, and Robert Chun's hurried instructions about what to look for and how to prepare the root if he found it. The other men in the settlement thought he was chasing ghosts. Thomas Pritchard said as much to his face when Caleb stopped to tell him where he was going. "You're wasting time," Thomas said. "Your daughter doesn't have time to waste. Stay with her. Be there when she passes. Don't go running off into the mountains chasing some savage's riddle." "It's not a riddle," Caleb said. "It's medicine. It might save her." "It's false hope," Thomas replied. "And false hope is crueler than no hope at all." Caleb went anyway. The trail led north and up, following the creek until it became too steep and broken to follow, then striking over land through country that seemed designed to kill travelers. The snow was deeper here, undisturbed by anything but animals. His legs ached, his lungs burned. The pack seemed to gain weight with every step. By midday, he'd reached country he'd never seen before. Old forest, the trees massive and silent, their branches heavy with snow. The world had a muffled quality here, sounds absorbed and deadened. He followed Robert's instructions as best he could. North-facing slopes, old trees, places where the forest floor would be rich with leaf mold and moisture. He found nothing. Hours passed. The sun began its descent. The temperature dropped. Caleb knew he'd have to turn back soon or risk being caught in the high country after dark without shelter. But turning back meant giving up. It meant going home to watch Rebecca die. It meant accepting that he'd failed both his daughters in the most fundamental way a father could fail. The tracks appeared just as he was preparing to turn back. Fresh tracks leading deeper into the forest. Human tracks. Unshod feet. Caleb followed them without thinking, past caring about danger or caution or anything, except the slim possibility that those tracks might lead somewhere that mattered. White Crow stood in a clearing surrounded by old hemlocks. He knelt beside a specific tree, brushing snow away from the base. When he saw Caleb approach, he didn't stop, just kept clearing the snow until a small area of forest floor was exposed. Then he stepped back and pointed. The ginseng grew in a sheltered spot where the roots of the hemlock had created a small hollow. The plant was dormant, its above-ground growth long since died back, but the root system was there, visible once you knew what to look for. White Crow gestured at it, then at Caleb, then made a digging motion. Caleb knelt and carefully began to excavate the root. He used his knife, working slowly, trying not to damage the plant. White Crow watched without helping, but his presence felt less like supervision and more like witness. Like he needed to see this through, needed to know that what he'd started would be completed. When the root was free, Caleb wrapped it carefully in cloth and placed it in his pack. He stood and faced White Crow across the clearing. The Indian watched him with those same neutral eyes, giving nothing away. "Why are you helping us?" Caleb asked. "We've done nothing but fear you, hunt you. Tell stories about you that paint you as a monster. Why would you save our children?" White Crow didn't answer. Perhaps he couldn't speak English. Perhaps he simply chose not to. The silence stretched between them, and Caleb realized he didn't actually need an answer. The root in his pack was answer enough. Whatever White Crow's reasons, they were his own, and they were sufficient. "Thank you," Caleb said. White Crow nodded once. Then he turned and walked away into the darkening forest, and Caleb was left standing alone in a clearing in country he barely knew, holding what might be the only chance his daughter had left. The journey back took 4 hours in darkness that was nearly complete. Caleb navigated by feel and memory and desperate need. He fell twice, once badly enough that he thought he'd broken his ankle. But the pain faded to a dull throb, and he kept moving, kept pushing, because Rebecca didn't have time for him to be injured, didn't have time for anything but speed and luck and prayers that might or might not be heard. He reached the settlement near midnight. Mary met him at the door with a face that told him Rebecca was still alive, but barely. Robert Chun was already there, summoned by Mary when she'd realized what Caleb was trying to do. He took the root and examined it by candlelight, his weathered hands moving with practiced efficiency. "Good," he said. "Very good root. Old root. Strong medicine." He worked quickly, cleaning the root and slicing it thin, then boiling the pieces in water with specific herbs he'd brought from his own cabin. The process took an hour. Rebecca's breathing grew shallower. Mary held her daughter and whispered to her. Meaningless words meant only to let Rebecca know she wasn't alone, that someone who loved her was there. When the tea was ready, Robert strained it carefully and let it cool, just enough to drink. They raised Rebecca's head and got her to swallow small sips, patient and persistent. She barely responded, but the tea went down. They repeated the process every few minutes until she'd consumed most of what Robert had prepared. Then there was nothing to do but wait. The night crawled past. Caleb sat with his back against the cabin wall and felt the accumulated exhaustion of the day pressing down on him. Sarah's body still lay on the table, a constant reminder of what he'd already lost. Rebecca's breathing continued its shallow rhythm. Mary held her and prayed in a whisper that barely carried across the room. Near dawn, Rebecca's fever broke. It happened suddenly, her body shuddering and then relaxing, the terrible heat that had radiated from her skin fading to something closer to normal. Her breathing deepened. Color began to return to her face. When the sun rose, she opened her eyes and asked for water in a voice that was weak but clear. Mary sobbed. Robert smiled and nodded like this was what he'd expected all along. Caleb felt something break inside his chest, relief so profound it was painful. His daughter would live. One daughter was dead, and nothing would change that, but the other would live, and that meant something, had to mean something. Robert prepared more of the tea, enough for Rebecca to continue drinking throughout the day, and enough to share with the other families whose children were still sick. Caleb carried the precious liquid from cabin as the sun climbed, explaining what it was and how to use it. Some families took it gratefully. Others looked at him with suspicion, asking where he'd gotten it, who had shown him. When he mentioned White Crow, their faces closed down, but desperation was stronger than suspicion. They gave the tea to their children anyway. By evening, 4 more children had turned the corner. By the next morning, 2 more. The tea didn't save everyone. 3 more children died that week, too far gone by the time the medicine reached them. But the rest survived, and within 10 days, the sickness had passed through the settlement like a storm, leaving grief and relief in equal measure. They buried Sarah on a hillside overlooking the creek. The ground had thawed just enough to dig. Mary said prayers. Rebecca stood between her parents, still weak but alive, and watched as they lowered her sister into the earth. The other families who'd lost children stood nearby, a small crowd united by shared grief. Thomas Pritchard was there, his own son among the survivors. He caught Caleb's eye across the grave and nodded, an acknowledgement that needed no words. After the burial, Caleb walked up into the high country one more time. He carried a haunch of venison wrapped in cloth, payment or tribute or simply thanks given form. He left it on a flat rock in a clearing he thought might be visible from wherever White Crow made his camp. He didn't see the Indian. Didn't expect to. But when he returned to the same spot 2 days later, the meat was gone, and in its place was a single white feather tied to a small branch that had been driven into the snow. Caleb took the feather home and showed it to Mary. She held it like it was precious, this simple token from a man they'd been taught to fear. She placed it on the mantel above the hearth, and there it stayed, a reminder of the winter they'd survived, and the help that had come from the most unexpected place. Spring came slowly to Timber Creek, the snow retreating inch by grudging inch up the mountainsides. The survivors of the winter emerged from their cabins like people waking from a long nightmare. Fields needed planting, repairs needed making. Life needed resuming. The settlement had been tested and had survived, though not without cost. The small cemetery on the hillside held 13 new graves, most of them children. But the settlement had also learned something that winter, though not everyone agreed on what the lesson was. For Caleb and Mary Warren, the lesson was clear. They'd been wrong about White Crow. The stories had been wrong. Whatever the Indian was, he wasn't the monster the tailies described. He'd saved Rebecca's life. He'd saved most of the children's lives if you followed the chain of events back far enough. Without his intervention, without the ginseng, the winter would have taken all of them. For others in the settlement, the lesson was more complicated. Thomas Pritchard's view had shifted, but not entirely. His son had survived because of the medicine White Crow had shown them. Thomas acknowledged that. But acknowledging a debt didn't mean trusting the person you owed. It just meant recognizing reality. And reality, as Thomas saw it, was that they still didn't really know anything about White Crow, where he came from, what he wanted, why he'd chosen to help them. Mystery bred suspicion, and suspicion bred the need for control. The real trouble began in early April, when a trader arrived from the east with news and supplies. His name was Marcus Webb, and he brought word from the fort that the colonial government was organizing a new militia to patrol the frontier. Tensions were rising between the British and French, with various Indian tribes caught in the middle or taking sides based on old alliances and newer grievances. The frontier was becoming more dangerous, and settlements like Timber Creek needed to be prepared for trouble. Marcus also brought new stories. A Delaware village 40 miles north had been destroyed by a force of settlers and militia, retaliation for a raid that may or may not have happened. Women and children killed along with warriors. The survivors had scattered into the wilderness, and now the whole territory was on edge. Violence breeding more violence in an endless cycle. He also brought renewed interest in White Crow. The bounty on his head had increased. 200 acres of land and 50 pounds sterling to whoever brought him in, alive or dead. The charges were the same as before: murder, theft, attacks on settlers. But now there was new pressure from the colonial authorities to clean up the frontier, to remove threats, to make the territory safe for expansion and settlement. Thomas Pritchard listened to all this with a face that grew steadily more thoughtful. That evening, he called a meeting of the settlement's men. They gathered in his cabin, 16 men of various ages and backgrounds united by the common goal of survival. Caleb attended because not attending would have been seen as a statement, and he wasn't ready to make that statement yet. Thomas laid out his thinking clearly. White Crow had helped them, yes, but that didn't change the fact that he was wanted by the authorities. It didn't change the fact that his presence near their settlement could draw unwanted attention, could make them targets if the wrong people thought they were harboring or protecting him. The smart move, the safe move, was to collect the bounty themselves, turn him over to the militia. Remove any question about where their loyalties lay. Several men nodded along. A few looked uncertain. Caleb felt sick. "He saved our children," Caleb said. "We owe him our lives. Some of us literally owe him our children's lives. And you want to repay that by turning him over for money?" "I want to repay it by keeping those children safe," Thomas replied. "The frontier's changing, Caleb, getting more dangerous. We need to think about the future, not just the past. We need to show we're loyal subjects who follow the law, not people who harbor fugitives." "He's not a fugitive," Caleb said. "He's a man who lives in the mountains and mostly keeps to himself. Everything else is just stories." "Stories that the authorities believe," Thomas said. "That's what matters. We can argue about truth and justice all we want, but out here, perception is what keeps us alive. And right now, the perception of White Crow is bad. If we don't address that, it could come back on all of us." Robert Chun spoke up from the corner where he'd been sitting quietly. "What proof of crimes?" he asked. "Anyone see actual crimes or just hear stories?" Thomas turned to him. "Does it matter? The authorities believe the stories. The bounty is real. The danger is real." "Danger from who?" Robert pressed. "From White Crow? Or from people who believe stories without proof?" The room fell silent. The question hung there, uncomfortable and unanswerable. Finally, John Henderson cleared his throat. "I don't like the idea of betraying someone who helped us," he said. "But Thomas has a point about safety. Maybe there's a middle ground. We could warn him. Tell him the bounty's increased and he should move farther away." Get him to leave the area without turning him over. Thomas considered this. It's not ideal, but it's something. Better than doing nothing. Caleb looked around the room and saw the same thing on most faces. Relief. A way to address the problem without actually dealing with the moral weight of what they were considering. Warn White Crow and let him be someone else's problem. Salve their consciences while protecting their interests. I'll do it, Caleb said. I'll find him and tell him. But I'm not part of any plan to turn him over. If that's what this settlement decides to do, you'll have to do it without me. Thomas nodded. Fair enough. Just make sure he understands the situation. And make sure he leaves. Caleb went into the mountains the next morning with a pack of supplies and a growing sense that something had shifted in the settlement, something that couldn't be easily repaired. The winter had brought them together in crisis, but spring was pulling them apart again. Old fears and new pressures creating cracks that might widen into chasms. He found White Crow in the same clearing where he'd found the ginseng. The Indian sat on a fallen log, working on a bough, shaving the wood with a knife in long, patient strokes. He looked up when Caleb approached, but didn't stop working. Caleb explained the situation as clearly as he could. The bounty, the increasing tensions, the pressure from the colonial authorities, the danger that White Crow's presence near the settlement might bring down on all of them. He tried to make it sound like concern rather than a threat, but he heard how it came out, heard the underlying message. You helped us, but now you need to leave because helping you back would be too dangerous for us. White Crow listened without reaction. When Caleb finished, the Indian set down his bow and knife and stood. He walked to the edge of the clearing and looked out over the valley below, the settlement visible as a cluster of cabins and cleared fields along the creek. He stood there for a long time, long enough that Caleb began to wonder if he'd understood anything that had been said. Then White Crow turned back and did something unexpected. He spoke. His voice was rough from disuse, the English words heavily accented, but clear enough. My people called me Wapasit. It means White Crow, name given because I am different, because I see things others don't see, because I don't fit. Caleb stared, too surprised to respond immediately. White Crow continued. I was Lenape, Delaware, you say, had family, had village. Then settlers came, sickness came. My wife died, my daughter died. Everyone died except me. I lived because I was away, hunting. Came back to find everyone dead or dying. He paused, his eyes distant with memory. Other Lenape said I brought sickness, said I was cursed. Cast me out. I came here, to mountains, lived alone. Then settlers came here too. They heard stories, added more stories. Made me monster. Why did you help us? Caleb asked quietly. After everything, why would you save our children? White Crow looked at him directly. Because children are children. Because sickness is sickness. Because I remember my daughter. Remember holding her while she died and not being able to stop it. Your daughter, my daughter, same. Pain is pain. Doesn't matter what color skin. The words hit Caleb like a physical blow. All this time, they'd been so focused on their own grief, their own losses, that it had never occurred to him that White Crow might have his own. That the man they'd feared and told stories about was himself a survivor of the same kind of tragedy that had nearly destroyed their settlement. I'm sorry, Caleb said, for what happened to your family, and I'm sorry for what we're doing now. You saved our children, and we're repaying you by asking you to leave. It's not right. White Crow shrugged, his frontier. Nothing is right. Nothing is fair. Just survival. Where will you go? West, farther from settlements, farther from stories. Find place where no one knows White Crow. Start again. Caleb reached into his pack and pulled out the supplies he'd brought. Dried meat, cornmeal, powder and shot, a new blanket. Not payment, because nothing could pay for what White Crow had done. Just offerings. What frontier people gave each other when words weren't enough. White Crow took the supplies with a nod of acknowledgement. Then he reached into his own pack and pulled out something wrapped in leather. He handed it to Caleb. For your daughter, he said, the one who lives. Caleb unwrapped the leather carefully. Inside was a small carved figure, a bird in flight, made from white pine and polished smooth. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, every feather detailed, the wings caught in the moment of upward sweep. It was the kind of gift that took days to make, the kind of care that spoke of thought and intention and something very much like affection. It's beautiful, Caleb said. She treasure it. Tell her, White Crow said, that being different is not curse. Tell her that helping others is not weakness. Tell her that stories people tell about you matter less than truth you know about yourself. Caleb nodded, his throat tight. They stood in the clearing for another moment, two men from different worlds who'd found common ground in loss and grief, and the simple act of helping another human being survive. Then White Crow picked up his pack and his bow and walked away toward the west, toward whatever life he might find beyond the frontier of fear and misunderstanding. Caleb watched him go. When the Indian finally disappeared into the trees, Caleb turned back toward the settlement with the carved bird in his hand and the heavy knowledge that what they'd done today was easier than what was right, but not nearly as easy as what they'd tell themselves to justify it. The trouble came 2 weeks later, but it came from an unexpected direction. A patrol of militia arrived from the fort, 20 men led by a captain named James Farthington. They'd been tracking reports of Indian movements in the territory and had heard stories about White Crow from traders and other travelers. When they learned he'd been seen near Timber Creek, they came to investigate. Captain Farthington was a career soldier, the kind of man who saw the frontier in simple terms: civilization versus savagery, order versus chaos, us versus them. He gathered the settlement's men together and asked direct questions. Had they seen White Crow? Did they know where he camped? Had they had any contact with him? Thomas Pritchard answered carefully. They'd seen him, yes, but he'd moved on, gone west as far as they knew. Not a threat to the settlement anymore, if he ever had been. Farthington's eyes narrowed. You sound almost sympathetic to him. We're just stating facts, Thomas said. He was around, now he's not. That's all. The captain looked around at the assembled men. His gaze lingered on Caleb, who'd been standing quietly to one side, trying to remain unnoticed. You, Farthington said. You look like you have something to say. No, sir, Caleb replied. Nothing to add, really. Because I've been hearing interesting things about this settlement. Hearing that White Crow helped you folks last winter, saved some children from sickness. That true? The silence that fell was thick with tension. Every man there knew that admitting contact with White Crow, admitting he'd helped them, would raise questions about why they hadn't reported it, why they hadn't tried to capture him. But lying to a militia captain was dangerous in its own way. He showed us where to find medicine, Caleb said finally. During a bad sickness, a lot of children were dying. He pointed out a plant that helped save them. Farthington's expression didn't change, but something cold entered his eyes. So you had direct contact with a wanted fugitive, multiple times, and you didn't think to inform the authorities? We were dealing with a crisis, Thomas said. Dying children. We weren't thinking about bounties or authorities. We were thinking about survival. And after the crisis? Farthington asked. When the children recovered, did you think about it then? We told him he should move on, Thomas said. Told him about the bounty, the dangers. He left. That was the end of it. Was it? Farthington looked around the settlement, taking in the cabins, the fields, the small cemetery on the hillside. Where did he go? West, Thomas said. That's all we know. The captain studied him for a long moment, then turned to his men. Search the area. I want to know if there's any sign of recent activity. Camps, trails, anything that might indicate he's still in the territory. Sir, Robert Chun spoke up. He is gone. Saw him leave myself. 2 weeks ago. Went over ridge to west. And I'm supposed to take your word for it? Farthington snapped. You people have already proven you can't be trusted to report fugitives. Why should I believe you now? Because it's truth, Robert said simply. "And because we have no reason to lie now. Don't you?" The captain's voice carried an edge of contempt. "I've seen this before. Settlers get isolated, start going native, start sympathizing with the enemy. Forget where their loyalties are supposed to lie. Maybe you folks have forgotten that White Crow is wanted for murder, that he's killed settlers, that he's a threat to everything we're trying to build out here." "Those are stories," Caleb said. "We never saw proof of any of it." Farthington turned on him. "You calling the colonial authorities liars?" "I'm saying stories grow in the telling. I'm saying we only know what we've seen with our own eyes. And what you've seen is an Indian who helped you." Farthington's tone was mocking. "How touching, how civilized. Tell me, did it occur to any of you that maybe he helped you so you'd protect him? So you'd hide him when authorities came looking? That maybe he's been using you?" The suggestion hung in the air, ugly and impossible to disprove. Caleb wanted to argue, wanted to explain that White Crow had asked for nothing, had expected nothing, had simply helped because helping was what he did. But he could see in Farthington's face that no explanation would matter. The captain had already decided what was true, and evidence that contradicted that truth would be dismissed or reinterpreted. The militia spent 3 days searching the area. They found White Crow's old camps, found signs of his passage, found evidence that confirmed he'd been living in the territory for months. What they didn't find was White Crow himself. The trail west that Robert had mentioned was real enough, clear enough to follow for several miles before it disappeared into rocky terrain that made tracking impossible. Before leaving, Farthington gathered the settlement together one more time. His message was clear. The frontier was becoming more dangerous. Tensions were rising, and settlers needed to be vigilant about who they trusted and who they helped. Sympathizing with the enemy, harboring fugitives, or failing to report wanted individuals would be treated as treason. The next time militia came through, they'd expect full cooperation, no hesitation, no excuses. After the militia left, the settlement felt different, darker. The easy trust that had developed over the winter had been replaced by wariness and doubt. Men who'd worked together, suffered together, celebrated their children's survival together, now looked at each other and wondered who might speak out of turn if authorities came asking questions again. Caleb felt it most keenly with Thomas. The friendship that had been developing between them, tentative but real, had frozen over. Thomas blamed him, Caleb realized. Blamed him for speaking honestly to Farthington, for not playing the game, for creating a situation where the settlement was now under suspicion. And maybe Thomas was right. Maybe honesty on the frontier was a luxury they couldn't afford. Maybe survival required a willingness to lie, to betray, to sacrifice others so that your own family could live. But Caleb couldn't accept that, wouldn't accept that. Because if that was what survival required, then what exactly were they surviving for? Summer brought heat and work and an uneasy peace. The fields grew. Children played. Life continued with the stubborn persistence that characterized the frontier. But underneath the surface routines, something had changed in Timber Creek. The settlement had lost its innocence, if it had ever had any to begin with. Caleb worked his land and raised his surviving daughter and tried not to think too much about White Crow alone somewhere in the western wilderness, driven away from country he'd probably known all his life because his presence made settlers uncomfortable. Rebecca wore the carved bird on a leather cord around her neck and asked her father sometimes about the man who made it. Caleb told her what he could, that White Crow had lost his own daughter, that he'd helped them because he understood their pain, that the world was more complicated than the stories people told. Mary listened to these conversations and worried. She'd survived the winter, lost one daughter, kept the other, found a strength she didn't know she possessed. But she'd also seen how quickly fear could turn to violence, how easily people could convince themselves that cruelty was necessary for safety. She watched her husband struggle with questions that had no good answers and wished there was something she could do to ease his burden beyond simply being there, being steady, being the thing he could count on when everything else felt uncertain. In July, a trader brought news that the militia had finally caught up with someone they claimed was White Crow. The confrontation had happened 50 miles west, near a French trading post. The Indian had resisted arrest and been killed in the fighting. His body had been brought back to the fort as proof, the bounty claimed by Captain Farthington himself. The news hit Timber Creek like a stone dropped in still water. Ripples spread outward, reactions varied. Some people were relieved. The threat, real or imagined, was over. They could stop looking over their shoulders. Others felt a vague sense of unease, as if they'd been complicit in something they couldn't quite name. A few, like Caleb, felt grief for a man they'd barely known but whose simple acts of kindness had saved their children and shown them something about humanity that the frontier usually worked hard to hide. Robert Chun was the one who asked the obvious question. He sought out Caleb in the fields one evening and stood watching the sun set over the western ridges before speaking. "You believe it was him?" Robert asked. "White Crow?" Caleb kept working, pulling weeds from around young corn plants. "I don't know, maybe. Or maybe it was just some other Indian they decided was him." "Who's going to say different?" "Make story easier," Robert said. "Dangerous savage killed, frontier safer. Everyone happy." "Are you happy about it?" Robert shook his head. "I think perhaps White Crow was not the only story we got wrong." Caleb straightened up, his back aching. "What do you mean?" Robert gestured vaguely toward the settlement. "We tell ourselves we are civilized. We have law, religion, family. We are bringing order to wilderness. But sometimes I think wilderness was fine until we brought our order. And sometimes I think our order is just another name for violence that makes us comfortable." "That's a hard thought to live with," Caleb said. "Frontier is hard place," Robert replied. "Full of hard thoughts. But maybe being comfortable with uncomfortable thoughts is what makes us actually civilized, not just pretending we are." They stood together in the fading light and didn't talk about White Crow again. But the conversation stayed with Caleb, worked on him like water on stone, slowly shaping something new from what had been. August brought the final piece of the story, though Caleb didn't recognize it as such when it began. A young Lenape man arrived at the settlement asking for trade. He was alone, which was unusual, and he carried himself with a wariness that suggested he didn't expect to be welcomed. Thomas Pritchard met him at the settlement's edge with a rifle in suspicion, but the young man spoke English well enough to explain that he had furs to trade for powder and shot. The transaction happened quickly, few words exchanged beyond what was necessary. The young man was preparing to leave when Rebecca came running from the cabin, the carved bird bouncing on the cord around her neck. She'd been playing and had forgotten herself, forgotten that strangers required caution, forgotten everything except childish enthusiasm. The Lenape man saw the carved bird and stopped. He stared at it for a long moment, then looked at Rebecca with an expression that Caleb, watching from nearby, couldn't read. "Where did you get that?" the young man asked quietly. Rebecca looked at her father, suddenly aware she might have done something wrong. Caleb came forward slowly, hands visible, non-threatening. "It was a gift," Caleb said. "From a man who helped us last winter." The young man's eyes moved from the carving to Caleb's face. "What man?" "They called him White Crow. We called him that. I don't know what his real name was." "Wapakaseet," the young man said softly. "His name was Wapakaseet. He was my uncle. He made birds like that for his daughter before she died. Afterward, he made them sometimes when he was sad, when he was remembering." "Was?" Caleb asked, already knowing the answer. "The man they killed at the French post was not my uncle," the young man said. "My uncle was already dead. He died in the mountains 2 months ago. An accident while hunting. I found his body and buried it according to our customs. The man the militia killed was just a hunter who was in the wrong place. They needed someone to be White Crow, so they chose him." The words fell between them like stones. Caleb felt something break inside his chest, anger and grief and guilt all mixing together. White Crow had left the territory to keep them safe, to remove himself as a source of danger to the settlement. And he'd died alone in the wilderness, no family, no friends. No one to mark his passing or remember his name except a nephew who'd found his body by chance. And then the militia had killed an innocent man and claimed the bounty anyway, because stories were more important than truth, and perception was more important than reality, and a dead Indian was a dead Indian, regardless of which specific dead Indian it actually was. "I'm sorry," Caleb said, knowing the words were inadequate, knowing nothing he said could make this right. "He saved my daughter's life. He saved a lot of children. He was a good man." The young Lenape nodded slowly. "He was, but good men die on frontier same as bad. Maybe faster, because they don't protect themselves properly." "Did he have other family?" Caleb asked. "People who should know what happened?" "No, I am last. Everyone else dead from sickness or war, or just hard living." He gave a bitter smile. "That is Lenape's story now. Used to be many, now are few. Soon will be none. And people like you will tell stories about how dangerous we were, how savage, how you had no choice but to make us gone." That's not Caleb started, then stopped, because it was. That was exactly what was happening, what had been happening, what would continue to happen. The settlements would grow. The tribes would shrink. The stories would justify whatever needed justifying. And in the end, the only people left to remember the truth would be the ones who had no power to tell it. The young man prepared to leave. Before he went, he approached Rebecca and touched the carved bird gently. "Keep this," he told her. "Remember the man who made it. Remember he was real person, not story. Real person with real grief who helped you anyway. That is worth remembering." "I will," Rebecca said quietly. "I promise." The young man nodded, then turned and walked away toward the forest. Caleb watched him go and felt the full weight of what they'd done, what they'd been part of, what they'd allowed to happen through action or inaction, or simply accepting the stories they'd been told, without question. Mary found him standing there an hour later, still watching the tree line, even though the young man was long gone. She took his hand without speaking, and they stood together while the sun set and the shadows grew long across the settlement they'd helped build in country that had belonged to others first and would belong to others again when they were gone and forgotten. The story spread through the settlement that evening, passed from cabin to cabin in quiet conversations that carried the weight of shame. The militia had killed the wrong man. White Crow had been dead for months. An innocent hunter had been executed so that Captain Farthington could claim a bounty and close a file that had been politically embarrassing. Thomas Pritchard came to Caleb's cabin after dark. He stood in the doorway, rifle in hand, looking 10 years older than he had that morning. "Did you know?" Thomas asked. "Before today, did you know?" "No," Caleb said, "but I should have guessed." "We all should have. The timing was too convenient. The story too neat." Thomas nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about that. About how easy it was to believe. How much we wanted to believe. Because believing it was easier than thinking about what we'd actually done." "What did we do?" Caleb asked, though he knew the answer. "We drove him away," Thomas said flatly. "A man who'd helped us, who'd saved our children, and we drove him away because keeping him around was inconvenient. Because it complicated our story about who we were and who he was. And then when we heard he was dead, we were relieved. Maybe not happy, but relieved. And that's almost worse." Caleb didn't disagree because he couldn't. He'd felt it too, that moment of relief when the news came. One less complication. One less thing to worry about. One less reminder that their survival had come with costs and compromises that didn't fit the story of noble settlers bringing civilization to the wilderness. "What do we do now?" Thomas asked. "What can we do?" Caleb replied. "White Crow is dead. The militia has their victory, false as it is. The settlement is safer because we bent the knee and played along. And somewhere out there, a young man who lost everyone is walking away, knowing that even in death his uncle couldn't escape being turned into someone else's story." Thomas stood silent for a moment. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. He tossed it to Caleb. "Half the bounty," Thomas said. "I couldn't stomach the thought of profiting from this. Didn't feel right. So I'm giving it to you. Do something with it. Something that matters. Something that maybe makes this less awful." "I don't want it," Caleb said. But Thomas was already turning away. "Neither do I," Thomas said. "But refusing it doesn't change what happened. Doesn't bring him back. Doesn't make us less complicit. So take it and figure out what to do with it, because I sure as hell don't know." He left. Caleb stood holding the pouch and feeling its weight, physical and moral. Mary took it from him and set it on the table. "Tomorrow," she said. "We'll think about it tomorrow. Tonight we just need to rest." But Caleb didn't rest. He lay awake, listening to Rebecca breathe in the loft above and Mary breathe beside him, and thought about White Crow alone in the mountains, making a carving for a daughter who could never see it, helping strangers who would ultimately betray him, dying alone because that was the only safe place left for him. September brought news that confirmed what the young Lenape man had told them. A French trader who'd witnessed the malicious confrontation passed through Timber Creek and shared what he'd seen. The dead man had been a hunter from a tribe allied with the French. He'd been carrying furs to trade. He'd resisted when the militia tried to arrest him because he didn't understand what he was being accused of. The fight had been brief and brutal, and afterward, Farthington had declared victory and claimed the bounty despite protests from the French traders who'd known the dead man and knew he wasn't White Crow. But who was going to contradict a militia captain? Who was going to argue with a story that made everything simpler for everyone involved? The colonial authorities got to claim they'd removed a threat. The militia got their bounty. The settlements got to feel safer. And if the truth was more complicated, if an innocent man had died, well, that was the price of security in dangerous times. The trader's story caused a stir in Timber Creek, but it was a quiet stir. People talked in low voices. Some expressed outrage. Others defended the militia, saying mistakes happened in the fog of war, that the dead man should have surrendered peacefully instead of fighting. That blame could be distributed in ways that made everyone a little bit guilty, and therefore no one truly responsible. Caleb watched it happen and understood he was seeing something fundamental about human nature. People could live with almost anything if they could find a way to justify it, to spread the responsibility thin enough that no single person had to carry the full weight. It was easier to accept injustice than to fight against it when fighting meant risking your own safety, your own family, your own future. But understanding didn't make it easier to accept. He made a decision. The bounty money, such as it was, went to support Rebecca's education. When she was old enough, he'd send her east to a school where she could learn to read and write properly, where she could gain knowledge and skills that would let her build a life beyond the frontier if she chose. And he'd tell her the story of how that money came to be, all of it, no lies or comfortable omissions. She'd learn about White Crow and about her father's complicity and about the cost of safety and the price of looking away. Maybe she'd understand. Maybe she'd judge him harshly. Either way, she'd know the truth, and that would be more than most people got. Mary agreed with his plan. She'd been thinking along similar lines, wanting their daughter to have choices they'd never had, wanting her to see the world with clearer eyes than the generation that had come before. Sarah's death had taught them that nothing was guaranteed, that children were precious and fragile, and deserved better than to inherit their parents' mistakes without understanding or examination. The settlement continued. Autumn brought harvest. Winter brought cold. Spring brought renewal. The cycle repeated as it always had, as it always would. Children were born. Old people died. The cabins crept farther into the forest, claiming land inch by inch, year by year. The tribes retreated or fought or made accommodation. The story of the frontier continued to be written in blood and hope and compromise. But in one cabin in Timber Creek, a carved wooden bird hung above the hearth. And sometimes, when the light caught it right, it seemed to move, seemed almost alive, seemed to carry a message from a man who'd been called a savage, but had proven more human than many who claimed civilization. Rebecca would carry that bird with her for the rest of her life. When she left the frontier for school, it went with her. When she returned years later as a teacher, bringing education to settlements that needed it, the bird was still around her neck. When she told the story of White Crow to her own children, she'd touch the carving and remember the man who'd made it, the uncle she'd never known, the father who'd tried to do right even when right was hard to find. And the story would be passed down generation to generation, changing in the telling as all stories do, but keeping at its core a simple truth: that kindness could come from unexpected places, that fear could blind people to what was real, and that the labels people placed on each other, savage, civilized, enemy, friend, mattered less than the choices they made when faced with another human being in need. Years later, long after the frontier had moved west and Timber Creek had become a settled town with a church and a school and a government, Caleb sat on his porch and watched his grandchildren play in the yard. Rebecca had married a teacher from Philadelphia and brought him back to build a life in the community where she'd grown up. Their children were free in ways their parents had never been, unburdened by the immediate threat of starvation or violence, able to think about the future instead of just surviving the present. Thomas Pritchard came by sometimes. He was old now, bent by years of hard work, but his mind was still sharp. They'd sit together and talk about the old days without nostalgia, just two men who'd lived through things and were trying to make sense of what those things meant. "Do you think we did the right thing?" Thomas asked one afternoon, the question coming out of nowhere, but also coming from everywhere, from years of accumulated doubt and guilt. Caleb knew he was talking about White Crow, about the decision to warn him away instead of hiding him, about the betrayal of turning him into someone else's problem, about all the small choices and compromises that had led to a good man dying alone and an innocent man being killed in his name. "I don't know," Caleb answered honestly. "Maybe there wasn't a right thing to do. Maybe there were just different kinds of wrong, and we chose the one we could live with." "And can you?" Thomas asked. "Live with it?" Caleb thought about that. Thought about Rebecca and her children. Thought about the bird still hanging in her cabin. Thought about the young Lenape man who'd walked away into the forest and probably died in one of the countless wars and diseases that were destroying his people. Thought about Captain Farthington, who'd probably gotten promoted for his decisive action in removing a dangerous fugitive. Thought about all the ways a single story could be told and retold until truth became irrelevant and only the useful lies remained. "I live with it," Caleb said. "I don't know if I can or should or whether that even matters. I just do. We all do. We live with what we've done and hope that somewhere down the line, someone learns from our mistakes instead of repeating them." Thomas nodded slowly. "That's not much of a legacy." "No," Caleb agreed. "It's not, but it's honest. And maybe that's worth something." They sat in silence and watched the children play. The sun moved across the sky. The world continued its rotation. And somewhere in the space between what had been and what might be, a carved wooden bird hung on a wall and remembered a man who'd been called a savage, but had proven himself human in all the ways that mattered. The frontier was gone now, moved west beyond the Mississippi, but its lessons remained. Fear was easy. Understanding was hard. Kindness required courage. And the stories people told about others often revealed more about themselves than about the people they were describing. These were truths that White Crow had known and lived. These were truths that had cost him everything. And these were truths that Caleb Warren, settler and survivor and complicit witness, would carry to his grave. The grandchildren were calling for him now, wanting him to see something they'd found, some treasure that seemed important in the way things do when you're young and the world is still new. Caleb stood slowly, his old bones protesting, and walked toward them. Thomas stayed on the porch, lost in his own thoughts. And in the cabin where Rebecca lived, the bird turned slightly in a breeze that came through the open window, its carved wings catching the light, its wooden form holding within it the memory of a man who'd carved it with careful hands and an understanding heart. A man who'd known loss and chosen kindness anyway. A man who'd been driven away by the very people he'd saved. A man whose story deserved to be remembered and told truthfully instead of being buried under comfortable lies. They had called him a savage. They had been wrong. And that wrongness, that failure of understanding and compassion, was something that would echo through generations, a reminder of what could happen when fear overcame humanity, when safety became more important than justice, when the stories people told about others became more real than the actual human beings those stories described. The sun set over Timber Creek. The children went inside. The old men eventually stood and went home. And the bird continued to hang where it had always hung, a silent witness to everything that had happened and everything that might have been. If only people had been brave enough to see past their fear and recognize another human being when he stood before them, asking nothing but to be allowed to live in peace.
Thanks for watching this story till the end. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from. And before you go, check out these other amazing Western stories waiting for you next. Subscribe, like, and I'll see you on the next ride.